Hi, welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on life underneath an ice shelf. My name's David Thornalley, and I'm a Professor of Ocean and Climate Science here at UCL. It's my honour and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sasha Montelli. Sasha's my colleague in UCL Geography, and he's a geophysicist and a glaciologist. His interdisciplinary research combines marine geophysical data with sediment cores and numerical modeling to reconstruct past interactions between ice sheets, ocean, and solid Earth on multiple temporal and spatial scales. Sasha's research projects have broad geographical coverage, spanning both hemispheres, including East and West Antarctica, the Eurasian Arctic, and subarctic Pacific. Understanding the future fate of our ice sheets is crucial for predicting sea level rise, how the climate system and ecosystems might be altered. And Sasha's work is providing the empirical observations and evidence needed to deepen our understanding of ice sheet behavior and to test and improve the models we'll use for future projections. So before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we'll have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during the talk by entering Slido on your web browser and entering the event code #ICE. Now I'm going to hand over to Sasha for his talk. Sasha, over to you. Look forward to your talk.
Thank you, David. Thank you for a lovely introduction. Yes. So I hope you can see the presentation. Today I would like to tell you a story about a very serendipitous discovery, unexpected discovery, which I was very fortunate to be part of as a co-chief scientist of the Schmidt Ocean Institute cruise to the Bellingshausen Sea in West Antarctica. So as a co-chief scientist, I was directing and guiding an interdisciplinary group of scientists, marine biologists, geologists, oceanographers, sedimentologists, to explore previously unknown areas of the West Antarctica. We were very fortunate to have in our possession the research vessel Falcor 2 here on the slide. 110-meter long, very capable vessel equipped with gravity cores, oceanographic equipment, and most importantly, remote underwater vehicle with HD cameras and push cores. However, it is not an icebreaker. So we were limited initially in our research plans to go to areas that are occupied by sea ice. So I will tell you a little bit about background first, and what is the context for these observations. Why do we care about Antarctic ice sheets, each ice sheet and its interactions with ocean and the seafloor? Then I'll talk briefly about cruise trajectory and the work that we've done in the Ron entrance in Bellingshausen Sea, and then go to perhaps the most exciting bit that followed the observations after calving of very large iceberg from the margin of George VI ice shelf. And then I'll conclude and take your questions. So first of all, ice sheets. Just for the broad audience, just a quick introduction in what ice is. So this is a NASA animation of Greenland ice sheet. And ice sheets are large continental scale masses of glacial ice. Here on this animation, you can see the virtual plane flowing over Greenland, and if plane has a radar, then it can illuminate multiple layers of ice that can form the ice sheet of thickness of up to 3.5 kilometers in case of Greenland. And these layers of ice are formed by continuous precipitation of snow over thousands of years, each layer then getting compressed by the layer above, forming the ice that then flows under its own weight and surface gradients. So the same happens in Antarctica, and that's why we have this large-scale Antarctic ice sheet, which can reach up to 4.5 kilometers thick in its central part. Now, when ice flows towards its periphery, it thins, and sometimes it reaches the oceans, and in the neighboring oceans, it thins to the extent that it becomes buoyant, and it forms this vast floating extensions of grounded continental ice sheets, the ice shelves, which provide unique environmental domains that are bounded by these multiple interfaces between ice, ocean, atmosphere, and the seafloor. You can see the schematic two-dimensional diagrams on this figure. And ice shelves play a critical role in the global climate as they regulate ice sheet mass balance through restraining flow from inland and modulate ocean circulation through the release of fresh water. This is just a video showing this, some of the field work and the video taken from helicopter, how the ice shelf environments actually look like. And you can see here a series of icebergs that are stuck in the thin crust of marine sea ice, usually up to just a few meters thick. And then far, far away in the background, you can see this vast platform sticking out of the water and of the sea ice, and that is the ice shelf that represents this vast floating extension of the ice that is grounded inland. In present-day Antarctica, ice shelves, which are here highlighted in gray, you can see from here the scale of these features. They cover approximately 1.4 million square kilometers, spreading over about 11% of the continent, roughly 75% of its coastline, nearly a third of its continental shelf. So some of the ice shelves here in the bottom and up there, Ross ice shelf and Rhône ice shelf, respectively, they're about the size of France. So few hundred meters thick, huge ice chunks, they block the sunlight and limit primary productivity of ocean cavities that lie beneath them at depth of up to sometimes 2 kilometers. And this diagram, it's actually going to be a time lapse that I'm going to switch on soon. It is gravimetric observations, which show the landmass change. And obviously ice shelves here are highlighted in gray because these gravimetric observations will not detect any change in gravity anomaly because ice shelves are floating. However, it shows us how the ice that is grounded, that is in touch with the bedrock, changed over the last 2 decades. And we see, first of all, here that the spatially heterogeneous nature of these changes, and second, that the ice mass loss is concentrated in the West Antarctica. This is dark red areas. Now, if we zoom into the observations of ice shelves themselves, we can see that ice shelves are also thinning with the rates of thickness change of up to a few meters per decade, and again, concentrated largely in West Antarctica. And the reason why ice shelves are thinning are due to surface melting at the interface between atmosphere and the ice, but also the basal melting, so the access of warm ocean waters to the ocean cavity, and that is the major component of current melt that we see. Not only they're melting, they're also retreating through calving, and there's this compilation of remote sensing imagery over the last 2 decades or so shows that actually over the last 20 years, Antarctic ice shelves cumulatively lost over 35,000 square kilometers, which is about 2% in area. And some of them, again, thinning up to 18% in less than 2 decades, which raises concerns not only in terms of climate, but also about the ecosystems which this rapid change gives disruption to. And the reason why this is happening is to a huge extent is melting by the oceans, and you can see here on this diagram showing the axis of ocean currents, particularly across the relatively narrow continental shelf in West Antarctica. And here is the zoomed in study area, which shows the sort of red current accessing the ice shelves and grounded parts of ice sheets as well through this topographic depressions called cross-shell troughs. And then below here in this diagram, you see this George VI ice shelf, which represents a unique ice shelf as a floating bridge So it's open-ended, northern side and Margaret Bay, and southern side and Rhone entrance. So there's presumably a large-scale oceanic circulation out and in both of these entrances. Now, the problem with ice shelves is that there are observations, direct observations of the cavities underneath, due to logistical challenges associated with accessing these cavities. These environments are the least known, among the least accessible and the least known and the least explored on Earth. Only a handful of observations are available, drilled through hot water drilling, and obviously the problem here is that you are very spatially limited in terms of the scope of the observations. However, you can access and evaluate the past environments through the geological record, especially as ice shelves calve and make the formerly occupied areas, formerly sub-ice areas available. And this diagram shows the range of processes that operate at the interfaces between seafloor, ocean, and ice. And here at the triple junction between the bedrock, ocean, and ice is sort of pile of sediment that then we can image using geophysical methods. And this is the seafloor morphology that actually is very useful for us to reconstruct the past environments. So this is geological and climatic component of it. However, these reconstructions do not give us understanding of life under the ice shelf and sort of in situ communities that live underneath. And with that in mind, this imagery, multi-beam imagery, shows the compilation of what we know about the seafloor of the planet, and obviously it's still remains poorly discovered with high resolution multi-beam imagery, but in particular so in the parts of Antarctica that are very close to the grounded ice as well as ice shelves, because the logistical challenges associated to go through the sea ice package and accessing these areas. And so I'll zoom into this Antarctic Peninsula area, Bellingshausen Sea, and this is again just a diagram showing how poorly studied this Bellingshausen Sea area, SA1 and SA2 on these diagrams labeled as SA1 as SA2, how poorly imaged they were to date. And with this in mind, this was our regional plan of several strategic areas and the study sites where we wanted to do interdisciplinary geological, oceanographic, and biological investigations. And the reason why we thought we could do that is because sea ice has been declining. You can see on the left overall area of the Antarctic sea ice and how it changed from 1979 to 2024. And on the right is just the white areas showing how the sea ice extent in March 1993, and then 30 years later, you can see that this white area in the West Antarctica is no longer there. So we were hopeful that we could access these areas that were previously inaccessible, especially if you don't have an icebreaker. Now, that's where there is George 6 ice shelf, as I mentioned, the open-ended ice bridge floating on top of the large ocean cavity, 500-meter long, quite narrow, from 10 to 50 kilometers wide. On the left, you can see the diagram showing the velocity of ice, so fast flowing, as it drains the ice from inland. And then on the right, you can see the seasonal ice thickness change. You can see that the ice has been, the George 6 ice shelf has been also losing mass at quite an increased pace. And then this is illustrated also quite well by this satellite imagery. If we compare 1979 and 2025, we'll see that the edge of the ice shelf actually retreated over 45 years, just about 50, up to 50 kilometers inland. So that raises concern about the stability of the system, but also, again, keeping in mind of the ecosystems that lie underneath. You start thinking about the very rapid and extreme change in conditions that this community that used to be blocked by light without any nutrient coming from above So what that might bring in terms of change to the ecosystems and environments underneath ice shelves. So we actually didn't hope to to get under ice shelf because we were not on an icebreaker, we didn't have the capabilities, but we were lucky to be able essentially, in effect, to do that. And I'll tell you why a little bit later, but these are cruise objectives. So we had multidisciplinary team. We wanted to reconstruct the past ice sheets, the ocean currents and ocean circulations, temperature and changes in the biogeochemistry, and the shelf-ocean exchange of glacial meltwater, understand how circumpolar deep water, for example, accesses this sensitive interfaces. And then finally, of course, the understanding of ecosystems and how it connects across the Drake Passage with the previous expedition in the southern Chile. So on the cruise trajectory, this map here shows the multi-beam data coverage, so the mapping using acoustic methods. And you can see that on 16th of January, we arrived onto the continental shelf, onto the edge of the shelf slope. And then it shows basically our mapping and our continuous ship tracks. And we did observations quite systematically of 3 ice shelf systems. Here in the center is Bach, Astench, and George VI ice shelves, and then went back to port. So we collected quite a lot of data, mapping thousands of square kilometers of seafloor with high resolution multi-beam imagery. We deployed oceanographic gliders, so sort of unmanned submarines that are operated from outside. Hundreds of hours of remotely operated vehicle footage, and hundreds and hundreds of samples of water, fauna, and geology. This is just to show you the location of the next slide, but before that, I just want to show you the example of even transit data, the multi-beam imagery. Here you can see the sort of thin stripe as we were just passing by, but it looks like a relatively boring flat seafloor, but actually what you can see here is this sort of regular patterns, repetitive patterns, ripped sort of laden rung hills, and those are actually thought to be produced by the tidally modulated squeezing of sediment up and down as ice retreats, and tides help the grounded ice squeeze the sediment up and down. So actually you can reconstruct quite a bit using even this little fraction data. In this case, it would be the rates of ice retreat, actually absolute rates of ice retreat, assuming you know the tides that are producing these fluctuations. And then if we zoom onto this area, it's just an example of the footage from recorded from the remotely operated vehicle, and it's really useful and valuable because here you actually have in situ characterization of the sediment that were deposited repetitively by ice sheets over timescales of thousands of years. So this is an incredibly valuable climatic record. Usually you would rely on sediment cores, but you don't see where you're actually coring usually. So here we were fortunate to actually know exactly visually we obtain our samples from. Now on the Stange ice shelf and work that we did there, we discovered and we got really close to the edge of the present-day ice shelf, and we discovered this terraced erosional patterns here in the left part of the map that I'm showing you, sort of the orangey bit. And this terraced bits, they actually remind us of something that we see on land, for example, in Svalbard. So that ice that erodes this bedrock underneath, leaving this terraces of original geological strata that was underneath, because ice is a very erodible agent, and so it can create this large topographic depressions. And now when we actually descend using ROV, we can confirm this hypothesis by seeing this terraces of bedrock, of metamorphic and igneous rocks underneath. And this is a very useful record, and we obtained lots of samples here. This is an example of a dropstone with a crater on it, and a coral. And when you are part of interdisciplinary team, it's sometimes quite funny because geologists would be tempted to log this sample as a dropstone or as a rock, whereas biologists would obviously log it as a crater. So there was quite a bit of debate about how to organize ourselves in an interdisciplinary team, but in a good way. We obviously collected, as I mentioned, gravity coring samples. So this is a long tube that descends down with some weight attached to it, and we obtained quite long cores, which is great because it means that the longer you go, the deeper in time you can then reconstruct the past environment and conditions and retreat of ice sheets and how it interacted with oceans in the past of up to last tens of 20,000 years ago, I think. And then obviously the push coring, which provides extremely valuable short samples. But again, advantage here is that we know exactly where we coring from. And these coring samples will allow us to reconstruct more recent centennial scale environmental change. And here in the middle of the screen, you can see that we see some sediment straight away. And we could see already this white sort of popcorn-like feature. This is actually a foraminifera, which is a carboniferous shell, calcium carbonate shell, and it's those are exactly what we are looking for in terms of dating the sediment and understanding the absolute chronology, because we can analyze it for radiocarbon and understand when this sediment was deposited, and therefore when ice retreated from the area. We also did quite a bit of experiments with pore water samples, again, to analyze for, in the future, for trace metals, alkalinity, many other things. And this work will enable understanding of very high resolution centennial, decadal to the centennial scale environmental change in the region. And then we were very fortunate to do the oceanographic observations. Is another essential component of the whole system. Two profiling flows that go up and down and measure the temperature and properties of the water column, chlorophyll, alkalinity, oxygen isotopes, and nutrients. And then we deployed the glider, which is the unmanned underwater vehicle that then is deployed from the Zodiac, and then as it goes down, it pops up and down, and receives directions of where to go. And here you can see some raw data showing live visualization of some properties of the water column that is measured. And this is extremely important as we want to understand exactly this ice-ocean interactions and rates of ice melt and why it melts as fast as it is. And for that, we need to understand the hitherto poorly studied ocean column. Now to perhaps the most exciting and serendipitous part of this cruise is that when we were just approaching the George VI ice shelf, and I'm going to show you time lapse daily on daily scale, optical imagery, and you can see if you start looking at this red box, you will see that already there is a rift propagating. So clearly it was very likely seemed to us that this bit would calve, but you cannot. It's very difficult to predict the exact timing of this calving, let alone what happens with that iceberg after it calves. And so if you just start looking at this red box, this is 26th of December, this is 2025 already, and then about 11th of January, 13th of January, this iceberg actually starts calving. And not only it calves, but it also drifts away rapidly. And that's because of the oceanic circulation structured the way, sort of clockwise circulation, that it just carries it away. And so what it means that if you go there straight away. You essentially are sampling in situ environments. And that's extremely fortunate for us because we actually were working just next door, just 50 kilometers away. And so given the unprecedented immediacy of sampling, the benthic community geomorphology and seafloor substrate, they definitely reflect pre-exposure conditions with minimal change to even to the water column aside from the potential upper ocean restratification caused by the iceberg passage. So here it's in static imagery. It shows you the juxtaposition of iceberg trajectory colored by date, and then we were there already just 4 days after iceberg left fully its parent margin. So two weeks after calving, and then 4 days or 5 days after iceberg left this area. And of course, it's really exciting because it's first time you can actually do this. Essentially, what in effect are sub-ice shelf observations with the really advanced observation kit, including and in particular a remotely operated vehicle. So you can actually look and sort of peek underneath and see what is there. And the first thing we do obviously is mapping. Here is just to show you if you're a creature living in this environment, what you would see. And this is a very rugged topography. So you can imagine something like Yosemite National Park and put it underwater and then put it under 200, 150 meter thick ice shelf. And that's what it is. So 100 to 1500 meter depth range. It's extremely rugged, extremely it's very significant changes in elevations. And then we again peaked underneath, and then this is just showing you different geological observations from walls that are fairly plain without any signs of life on it. And then we start seeing sponges, start seeing corals, start seeing in here in the middle you see some shrimp, and then occasionally even more corals and even more diverse life. And then finally, perhaps for us, what we thought was probably the most astonishing imagery that we saw was this sort of hanging gardens of colors of this sort of sunset pastel color spectrum. It was just absolutely remarkable to observe, hanging from a wall of bedrock, clearly either metamorphic or igneous, yet to be analyzed. But the direct sampling of what can be underneath. So you can imagine this thriving, bursting life underneath extremely cold, absolutely dark conditions. And that must mean that the nutrients and the life is sustained through the nutrients advected laterally through the oceanic circulation. And indeed, our oceanographic observations actually show this clockwise oceanic circulation. So water comes in the northern part, and then meltwater comes out in the southern part, and this vigorous circulation perhaps actually ensures this thriving habitat. Sometimes actually more diverse, according to the biology team, more diverse than parts of the seafloor that have been investigated that lie off of the margin of the ice shelf. So quite remarkably diverse, unexpectedly diverse to us. And then again, another oceanic observation using another glider that we deployed, and that was deployed very close to the margin. And we again received lots of information about the oceanography and currents that we are still processing at the moment. And the biologists just shared some preliminary observations of their logging of how many different species they found. Here you can see the sort of preliminary histograms of different creatures: sea urchins, corals, sea cucumbers, fish, sponges, in the different areas. Some areas are very deep, 1500 meters, and some areas actually are really shallow. 200 meters deep means that actually, given the current rates of ice shelf thinning of a couple of meters per year, if we extrapolated it into the past, ice shelf, which was just 150 meters thick, just yesterday, means it probably was grounded, so completely covering the shallow areas in the top right that are in sort of bright yellow or bright yellowish green. And so though this sort of the depth range actually is very useful here, because it enables us to investigate the sort of spectrum of habitats in the past, from recently deglaciated to perhaps the deep areas that were not in contact with ice for quite a long time. And so I'll just again show you just the compilation that biologists kindly provided of different kinds of corals, sponges, different kinds of fauna, including fish, sea spiders, fish coexisting with halaturians like sea cucumbers, sea urchins, anemones. Really beautiful image here on the top left, and even krill, which is actually quite interesting because those we saw exactly in the area where there's a huge chlorophyll abundance, and we think that this chlorophyll abundance was actually very rapid change induced by the freshwater injection after calving of the iceberg. So it was very fresh change to the area. And then I could recommend you this piece in National Geographic that was published about our expedition. This is beautiful, remarkably large sponge. And according to biologists, sponges of these dimensions take centuries to grow, indicating again how well sustained this life is under this extreme environments. And then finally, perhaps my personal favorite creature that we saw was the squid, really beautifully imaged here. And then on the background, you see also the sponges, and then the bedrock covered with the sedimentary substrate, which we will analyze for the recent and long-term geological and oceanographic change in this area, to help reconstruct the evolution of this area and the climate in this area a little bit better, to provide some context for the future change and the current change that we observe in Antarctica, and also to help constrain the numerical models that aim to predict the future of the system. Just to summarize, the cruise allowed us, we were really fortunate to be able to collect the data, very diverse kind, interdisciplinary observations, just days after the calving of an iceberg of the area of the size of Chicago, and discovery of very diverse and sustained ecosystems, likely driven by this lateral advection of inflow of nutrient-rich waters to underneath the ice shelf, and showing that life has a remarkable ability to thrive and be sustained in the most extreme environments on Earth. And we recovered lots of potentially datable sediment, which allow us to reconstruct the geological, glaciological, oceanographic history of this area. And on that, I would like to thank all of the partners, Schmidt Ocean Institute, all of the colleagues on board and the team, and UCL for organizing this talk, and conclude with the very last image as we pop out of the underwater and reach the surface and interface between ocean and atmosphere. And I would be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sasha. That was fascinating to see the footage you got from under the ice shelf there. So we've had a few questions come in, but I'd like to just encourage everybody, if you do have questions for Sasha, then again, you can go to Slido, and the code is #ICE, and we'll be able to pose those questions to Sasha. We've got plenty of time, If I may, I just wanted to maybe start with my own question. A lot of people won't be familiar with what it's like to go to sea and undertake this type of work. I wonder if you were able just to talk a little bit about what's life like on a research ship. Is it very easy? How does it work? What are some of the highlights and lowlights?
For me, it's been the fourth time on a ship, and I think it depends on if you're really genuinely interested in the research, then I think it creates the microcosm of its own, and time flows differently, and it's absolutely remarkable experience. So for me, it was incredible, despite obviously the scheduling. It's not like you work in shifts, especially as a chief scientist. Sometimes you have to wake up in the middle of the night, and sometimes, in very challenging ice conditions, for example, they could wake you up, say, we can go to do and undertake this observations that you planned, and then you have to redo it straight away on the go. So you have to be very flexible, but I think that makes it even more exciting in a way, even if it's sometimes a bit tiring. But there also the diversity of people and the backgrounds, the incredible interdisciplinarity of the team, being able to learn from biologists, oceanographers, very enriching. And the ship itself, it's one of the nicest ships I've been on, and Schmidt Ocean Institute put a lot of effort to make the ship actually quite cozy, with lots of areas where you can relax, with big windows where you can occasionally observe large icebergs passing by. So I personally had the incredible time, both as a researcher but as a person as well.
Great, thanks very much. So we've got a couple of questions come through on Slido. So the first question is, do we expect much more life to evolve with the melting ice?
Is it the question about particular geographic location? Would life evolve in particular geographic location, or because if we are talking about the particular location, then you can imagine that if your ice melts or calves, is Calvin thing. Calvin is probably more important, because what happens is that you uncover this area and give access of light, so that, and also nutrients to rain from above. So it's a new access of nutrients, and I would expect it to affect the biodiversity positively, if we can call it this way, in a sense of the just new access pathways of nutrients, and therefore and access of light, and therefore that should boost biodiversity in principle. On the other hand, our work showed that just in adjacent areas which was not covered by an ice shelf, not the ones that I showed you, it's difficult to quantify, obviously, but according to biologists, from the sort of semi-quantitative qualitative observations of diversity, the life that we observe in that location under an ice shelf was actually more diverse than the one outside, but that could be dictated due to regional difference in topography, pathways of delivery of nutrients, oceanographic currents. But I think that in one particular location, we would see life evolve and flourish even more. And I think what our work provides is a unique time zero, unique baseline. So 5 years on, or even a couple of years on, it will be very interesting to go back there. And because we have exact coordinates of everything we collected, we can do exactly same routes, go on exactly same road with the ROV, and say, how is that particular sponge doing? Of course, we won't be able to see how the particular squid is doing, because probably moved away. But I think our work provides this very unique and comprehensive baseline to answer this question.
Do you have any sense of how similar what you saw was compared to other regions? Have there been many cases where people have been able to look comprehensively under the ice shelf? Does it compare well? Do you get the impression that there's lots of different types of species and habitat?
there is, so again, very limited observations obtained through boreholes, a handful, and there, of course, your spatial limited. So you're almost comparing different things in a way. So if you it's almost like subsampling our observations and then comparing the subsample, which could be, in some parts of our study areas we didn't see much, but in some we did. So it depends on whether we're lucky or not. But they did find some biodiversity, but not nearly as what we found. But that could reflect the spatially limited nature of borehole observations. There were observations, I think, of Larsen ice shelf made also after iceberg calving, but they were made over a year, several months after the calving event. So that likely reflects adaptability or adapted life. So it's not really in situ, given how quickly life can actually adapt. But we are actually now writing up a paper trying to condense all of that, what's available in terms of biological observations. But so far seems like the diversity of thriving life we found is fairly unprecedented.
Okay, great, thanks. We have another question asking, how will increased tourism affect Antarctica?
Obviously, as somebody who studies this fragile environment, we have a privilege to go there, and maybe it's hypocritical to say that tourists should not go there. But I think in this fragile environment, obviously there is no way how tourism can positively affect it, affecting the species, obviously polluting the very pristine environments. So yeah, there is. I think the answer to this is fairly obvious. Maybe the question is what to do to motivate and stimulate people who organize the tourism to Antarctica to make it as responsibly as possible. But yeah, the answer to the question is yeah, I think it's fairly obvious that it's not affecting this pristine environment and fragile environment in a positive way.
Thanks. The question came in, you mentioned this is your 4th trip. Are there any insights you can share from your previous trips?
So the previous trip was the previous Antarctic trip. We were also very fortunate, actually, because you may have heard about this cruise. The idea behind it was actually not primarily scientific. It was to look for the science and to try and find the shipwreck of Endurance, the vessel of Sir Ernest Shackleton expedition. And I was on the first one that failed to do that. But what that enabled us to do actually is to have access to really expensive unmanned submarines that can map the seafloor. They can come up very close. Because they cannot come up very close, the density of measurements increases to the extent that you can measure the seafloor and image the seafloor with the resolution of meter, if not half a meter. And what it meant for us is actually we could use it for science during the trials, and we used the time really well. Over 2 days, we collected super high resolution observations of something that was only imaged in 50 meters resolution. So it's 2 orders of magnitude improvement, and it's almost like getting a microscope. And what we saw there, and I showed you actually a little bit on this transit line of this rung and ladder patterns on the seafloor. And we think they are formed due to the tidally modulated ice retreat, as grounding line during the overall ice retreat phase pushes up and down, and the spacing between those features, which we can only, because they're so delicate and gentle and subtle, we can only recognize them with this high resolution imaging. That allows us to actually reconstruct the absolute rates of retreat sometime in the past, which was quite a new thing to do, but that relies heavily on the technology. So that's a big example when you have to be lucky to be able as a scientist to have access to those equipment. because without it, we wouldn't be able to discover those features.
Yes, that question you were mentioning, how that was linked to trying to find the endurance, it maybe links up to the earlier question about tourism. Are there any opportunities for, deploying scientific equipment, imaging equipment on tourist vessels, ships of opportunity to try and really map out what's happening to Antarctica? Are you aware of whether that's happening?
I think a couple of companies actually doing this. Now, whether they're doing this for their, to sort of for the image purposes, as to pretend that they actually doing this or not, I think the matter of fact that if they actually do that, and if they actually enable scientists on board do some scientific work, then it's great. So if you compare to scenarios where it would go there anyway, and scenario where it would go there but with scientists on board, then it's fantastic, but relatively fantastic. But I know of a couple. I don't remember the names, but I know of a couple initiatives that actually incorporate working with scientists on board on tourist vessels.
So another question that's come in is asking about whether the biological findings might be affected, a little bit inaccurate, due to some of the species suffering rapidly due to the rapid increase in sunlight. To what extent, I guess, are your observations biased by the fact that maybe some things, even with a few days, I guess you mentioned about how you saw that chlorophyll bloom.
Yeah. No, I think the observations we have are already quite exceptional. It would be great to have observations in situ right during the moment and after the moment that iceberg calves. So it's very difficult to say. I'm not a biologist, so I'm not quite sure about the time scales of adaptation to this rapid change in conditions. Perhaps it wouldn't be benthic. Obviously, it would be surface communities that would be perhaps affected quite rapidly, and I think that's why we see this chlorophyll indeed and krill. But that's in the surface. In terms of benthic communities that occupies sea floor of depth of 1.5 kilometers, then it's probably very likely very much can be treated as very much in situ, and it's unlikely to be changed really. But the upper part and the shallow seafloor, as well as just the water column, yeah, it's very difficult to say. We only have the observations we got. So.
Great. Thank you. So another question from me. You obviously, it was a fantastic opportunity to see this iceberg carving off the ice sheet. How normal was that? Was this an exceptional event, do you think? How rare was it? Is it part and parcel of the ongoing climate changes in the region?
So icebergs calve obviously all the time, but at the same time, ice also is gaining mass inland. So you can imagine a situation where icebergs still calving, but ice is advancing, and that's what's happening in some parts of the ice shelf. But in bulk, as I said in the talk, it lost about 36,000 square kilometers of ice in icebergs over the last 2 decades. Now, as for the icebergs of these magnitudes, they're named. A means it's exceptionally large icebergs, like CT size. In our case, it was 350 square kilometers. Now, my previous expedition, Antarctic expedition, I was actually fortunate we moored next to iceberg A68, which calved in 2017. And 8 years later, this is iceberg A84. So you kind of do the math about, couple a year. That's how frequently on average, iceberg of this magnitude, calving of icebergs of this magnitude happens. But overall, yeah, as I showed this chart greens, nice compilation of coastlines of Antarctica over the last 20 years. At large, it's losing mass. Retreating coastlines are shrinking.
Really highlights the fact that if you're only getting a couple of these large icebergs calving each year, you were just how fortunate you were to be in that region as this
Yeah,
event
and
happened.
even so clearly you can see already, you could see, as I mentioned, in this December 2024, you saw this reef propagating, but there is no way to accurately simulate that because there are so many variables that you don't know. There's seafloor topography we don't know. We don't know very well oceanic circulation, the strengths of circulation. There's even weather, atmospheric melting, hydrofracturing. So even if we knew that, I guess there would be still uncertainties associated with that. And that's number one. It's about predicting when iceberg calves. Now, icebergs sometimes can stick around if they encounter relatively shallow areas or if there is no strong circulation outside. Like as iceberg A68 was, I think, just by sort of hanging around by its parent margin of Larsen Sea ice shelf for a couple of years, I think, until it finally drifted rapidly. So then after that, you have to predict that it will drift away rapidly and also rapidly enough so that you could do the observations. So it's almost impossible, I would say. If I saw something like that in a grant proposal, I would, as a reviewer, I would be excited, but I would not say say yes for this because it's extremely unlikely, even if it's so exciting. So we were just extremely fortunate, extremely lucky.
So you talked a little bit about this at the end of your talk. What's the next steps for the work coming out of this particular cruise and this particular project?
I think there are so many strands that to do further research about detailed evaluation of ecosystems. We are thinking, for example, of also using this quite broad data set for automated identification of species, using machine learning for automated identification and characterization of biodiversity. Obviously, geological reconstructions, past ice-ocean interactions, past oceanographic change. We collected lots of samples of bedrock, which actually could be used for characterization of the overall geology of the area, which we also don't know. It's ironic, perhaps, that like geologists would go and see outcrops on land, but in Antarctica, at least in the areas where we went, it's impossible. So it's only possible to see underwater. So we did proper geological sort of sampling and looking at the outcrops underwater. And also these rocks could contain important information about the history of like very long-term evolution of the continent, like history of cooling and where these rocks came from. And that's also important for understanding very large scale evolution of the continent, let alone models really rely on the characterization of substrate of the bedrock, because ice flowing on top of one type of rock can be different compared to another, especially if it's sedimentary rock. So all those observations are really important. So it's like a constellation of different types of observations that we now have to sort of think strategically about how we structure. And yeah, I think that the data we have will provide quite a bit of material for postgraduate projects as well. So we're looking forward to look at the further results.
We had another question coming in that was asking whether calving events are more common on the west side. I'm not sure if that's referring to the West Antarctic Peninsula versus the east or the western side of the peninsula.
I think the West Antarctica, if you look at the Antarctic ice sheet, then yes, if you remember from the Chart Green diagrams, most West Antarctic ice sheet is retreating and also thinning more rapidly than the East Antarctic, relatively stable. That's partially because it's mostly based, so that the base of the ice sheet in Antarctica is largely above sea level, so it's thought to be more stable, apart from a couple of areas which are actually also marine based, like West Antarctica. But in terms of, now there is, I think, another side how you could interpret this question, in terms of contribution of why ice is actually losing mass. In West Antarctica, it's dominated by meltwater, actually, and meltwater from underneath. So there's surface melting that contributes to thinning, but that's mostly on the fringes, on the very outer part of the ice shelf, and it's it's not the majority of the mass loss. Majority of the mass loss is because of this large, of the incursions of circumpolar, relatively deep circumpolar deep water to the base of the ice shelf and then thins from underneath. So the ice loss from West Antarctica is mostly due to the ocean melt, we think, whereas in East Antarctica it's actually dominated by icebergs. And we think, first of all, lack of this access of ocean water to sub-ice shelf cavities, but also due to the fact that many of these ice sheet sectors are cold base. It's less susceptible to melting from subglacial meltwater. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we ought to wrap things up. Very quick final question from me. Have you got any plans to go back to Antarctica?
Absolutely. Well, one most obvious idea would be, and I don't think it's a crazy idea now because we have this unique baseline data. I think, we could have made a good case for going there again over time scales of couple of years, and then obviously it always depends on the funding landscape, but it gives me a lot of satisfaction and joy, and that's kind of what I do my research for. So in a way, so yeah, there are plans for sure. If they haven't, I'll keep you updated.
Great. Thanks very much for answering all those questions, Sasha, and thanks again for your fascinating talk.
Thank you very much.
So that wraps things up for today. And we'd be really keen for you to provide some feedback if available. And so there's a QR code now shown on the screen. So if you're willing to complete that, we'd be very grateful. Should only take a couple of minutes, and it's multiple choice. So if you want to log into that, we'd be very grateful. I'd also just like to let you know about the next lunch hour lecture, which is titled Building Better, the Case for Democratic Infrastructure. And that's going to be held on the 4th of November from 1 till 2 p.m. Okay, and so with that, I'd just like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today and hearing about Sasha's work. And once again, Sasha, thanks again for your talk. And the best of luck writing up and investigating all the new observations that you made during your expedition. Thanks very much. Great to see you all.
Thank you.